I'm back for another highly illogical episode of Theories in Swim Baiting. What I'm going to discuss is what is often referred to as long lining, but what I like to call going beyond the breaking point. I like to call it the breaking point because it causes my mind to get into a different place that encourages me to perfect the technique and get inside the mind of the trophy bass that I'm targeting. I believe that there's a certain point at which bass decide if they're going to commit to the bait or not. And by creating distance between myself and the bait that's greater than what they're used to, I feel it really increases my chances of getting the big bites. I honestly feel there is a certain length of a cast that the fish have become well accustomed to. And with that, it really causes them to kind of go into that, tight lip mode where they're extremely hesitant about committing to the bait. So what I kind of adopted through a lot of trial and error is figuring out what that point was that they would let their guard down and commit. So diving into it a little bit further, what I've found after spending a lot of time really focusing in on this technique on very specific spots on certain bodies of water is that at some point, and what I typically think is the point at which a boat normally is at on a standard cast, once my bait goes beyond that traditional standard cast, I'm now in game time mode. If I've had bass chasing that bait, which I assume they are because I'm fishing the spot for a reason, I feel the odds of me getting that fish to commit now that I've gone past the threshold of where a bait would normally start tracking back up to the boat. Once I go beyond that threshold, that's where I start really getting excited and anticipating the bite. Just to kind of go off on a little bit of a side tangent, maybe a rant, but typically when people mention long lining, they say it with like some negative connotations. I'm not really sure why that is. It's been a highly successful technique for me, and I know a lot of other guys. But I think it's this tourney mindset that kind of puts that stigma on it that it's a bad thing. Well, in my opinion, I'm out there playing by my own rules. As long as I'm not breaking any laws, I'm gonna do what I deem to be the most successful way to catch the biggest, baddest fish in the lake. And if that means dumping an entire spool of line out on a spot and pushing my boat an additional 100 feet back, so be it. If that's what I gotta do to catch that big fish, I'm gonna do it. So maybe there needs to be a little bit of like moment of reflection on what we're doing here in the pursuit of giant bass. Is the goal to play by certain people's rules, or is the goal to actually catch big fish? My opinion, I'm there to catch big fish, so I'm not playing by anybody else's imaginary rules. It's what I deem morally acceptable. It's game on after that. With that said, we'll carry on to the next point, but I felt like it was important enough that I had to address it and go on a little micro rant about it, because we all hear how someone talks about someone else catching fish when it wasn't a way in which they deem the right way to catch fish. So at any rate, moving forward, as you saw in the most recent video, Dock Monster, full story, 3 for 30 pounds, the technique can be very productive. You can get some big bags out of just presenting your bait slightly different than most of the anglers. But what needs to be mentioned is I've spent a lot of time trying this specific technique on a multitude of different spots, and it wasn't productive. It's very selective of how fish set up on a spot traditionally and how most anglers fish a spot. The whole idea behind long lining, or what I've referred to as going beyond the breaking point, isn't to outsmart the fish. I'm trying to outsmart the fishermen that typically fish that spot by providing a different look for my bait and how it moves through the water. When you dump that amount of line out, which I'm fishing a 400 TE and I'm dumping pretty much 3/4 of the spool out, my bait is going to stay down in the strike zone for that much longer. And that's a specific key detail in getting those big bites. And I think that most of us understand that when you make a long cast, and I'm not the world's best caster by any means, and maybe that's why I like this technique more, but if you do a normal cast and you throw your bait out and you dump some line, just let it sink straight down, when you start your retrieve, there's only a certain distance before your bait starts tracking back up towards the boat. So throwing out on a normal bomb cast and dumping a bunch of line and then pushing your boat an additional 100 feet back, basically repositioning your boat while dumping the line, now just almost doubled or tripled the amount of time that your bait is going to be in the strike zone. And I can't stress the importance of keeping your bait in the strike zone. Now that strike zone is going to vary from spot to spot. It might be 30 feet, it might be 15 feet. That all depends on the spot you're fishing. Like I've discussed in those, programming catchable fish to be uncatchable, I think this is highly valuable on highly pressured spots. I'm of the firm belief that fish have become so programmed that they can identify a typical cast length. Now what that is, I'm not sure, but let's take a guess that it's probably about 100 feet, maybe a little bit longer, 120 feet. Now those fish have seen that same length time and time again. They know the distance, it's gonna come down, it's gonna bang into that spot, and then it's gonna track for a while, and then it's gonna start heading back up towards the boat. Especially if you're sitting in deep water. You're fishing 30 feet, you're fishing an island top or whatever, and your boat's out over 30 feet. Your bait's gonna go down and then start tracking up long before you ever see your bait. It's not gonna come straight up to the boat for the most part. So I feel like by creating that extra space of where a boat would normally be sitting, and I move my boat back an additional 100 feet, now when I've made that cast that a typical angler would make, and it splashes down out here, and then the bait would be retrieved and it comes up. Well, if I've splashed down out here, but now I've dumped a bunch of line and I push all the way back to here, well, now I've created that much more distance. And I feel once my bait gets to the point at which a lure would normally start tracking up, but doesn't, and it keeps tracking down there in the strike zone, that's where you get the bite. Boom! Something has switched in their mind that goes from being hesitant to now going, this might be the real deal. Only way I can find out is if I bite it. And from my own personal experience, probably 95% of the time, that bite comes directly under where a boat would normally be sitting. That's what I have found most of the time. It's that extra distance causing that point of commitment that I think just flips them. Whether it's a conscious decision that they're fully aware of, or it's just the ingrained repetition, there's something there. Now, my idea behind it could be completely false, but I'm just going off of patterns that I've witnessed firsthand on the water. There might be some other scientific explanation to it, but I tend to believe they are so in tune and so used to the repetition of how something feels, the actual literal time a bait is spent in the water and tracking that bait. There's something about going beyond the breaking point that really gets them to flip over and turn into game on, I'm going to commit to this. But like I said before, this is a technique that I found to be very effective at very specific spots. I've tried it at a lot of places and failed miserably. So it's not something that I just go and do all the time now. I might experiment a little bit here and there, but I've kind of learned to identify certain potential spots for this technique just from experience of where it's been successful and it hasn't been successful. Typically it's island tops, big rock piles, some type of up and down motion where people would normally fish the up part or the down part, but not both parts in one cast. Those are the spots that really perform well in this scenario. And even with that said, there's still those exceptions. But if you find yourself in a scenario where a spot is holding fish, but you can't get them to bite, and they almost commit to it, but they just won't, try going beyond the breaking point. Give yourself that extra distance. Separate your lure from the boat and see what kind of results that produces for you. So that wraps up this Theories in Swim Baiting. If this is your first episode, you want to catch up on some of the others, there'll be some videos on the screen. Let me know what you think in the comments. I like the discussion. I think it's relevant. I think it helps us all. There might be something that's said in the comments that I've never thought about, and that's good. We're all out there in the same game in the pursuit of giants.